Standing my ground against a powerful homeowners association cost me more than just peace of mind, it nearly cost me my freedom. But what they didn't know was, they picked the wrong family to mess with. I was arrested, handcuffed on my own land, accused of violating laws I never even heard of. But it all started with a knock on the door, and a man in a suit holding a map that didn't have my farm on it. When I turned 40, I didn't expect I'd be fighting a war. Not overseas, but right here, in Maple Hollow, on the 40-acre plot that had been in my family since 1946. This land wasn't just dirt and timber. It was history. It was where I learned to fix a fence under my granddad's watchful eye, where my mother planted wildflowers every spring, and where my father, a man so dedicated to his military career he barely made it home for Christmas, taught me what it meant to protect something that mattered. After Grandpa passed 5 years ago, I left the city behind. I'd been working construction in Tulsa, but I traded steel-toed boots for mud-stained overalls, took over the farm, and did my best to honor the family name. I wasn't rich. I didn't have a fancy house, but I had peace. Until the bulldozers came. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. Just past my property line, I saw machinery moving earth like it was candy clay. They called it Cypress Ridge Estates, a luxury development with stone mansions, tennis courts, and infinity pools. I figured it was the same old suburban sprawl. I wasn't thrilled, but I wasn't naive either. Live and let live. That's what I believed. But it wasn't long before that let live part disappeared. One Tuesday morning, I was patching the barn roof when a black SUV kicked up dust on my gravel drive. Out stepped a man who looked like he hadn't set foot on dirt in his life, polished shoes, a navy blue tie, and a clipboard. "Mr. Lawson, I'm Robert Wilson, president of the Cypress Ridge HOA, he said, offering a hand as cold as his stare. "Beautiful piece of history you have here." I didn't shake his hand. "What do you want?" I asked, wiping sweat from my brow. Wilson walked right into my kitchen like he owned it, unfolded a glossy map on my table. There it was, my land, surrounded by a pastel-colored dream of a gated community. In the middle, a blank square. "My farm." "We're creating something special here," he said, smiling like a predator. "The only issue is your property. It doesn't quite fit the aesthetic." Then came the offer, a number that sounded big. But it was barely 60% of what land like mine was selling for just a few miles down the road. I looked him in the eye and said, "This land's not for sale. Not for any price." His smile tightened. "I understand sentimentality," he replied condescendingly. "But the community's growing. The county's changing. And quite frankly, we have support from the top down." "Then it'll change around me," I said. He left a business card on my table and a warning that regulations can change. That's when I realized, this wasn't a polite offer. It was the opening move in a hostile takeover. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The cold shoulders at the diner. The way old friends couldn't meet my eye. The HOA wasn't just planting trees and enforcing lawn rules, they were working backdoor deals with the county, the sheriff's office, maybe even the zoning board. But what hit me hardest wasn't the money. It was the arrogance. That a man in a suit could walk onto land my grandfather fought to keep safe and tell me it didn't belong anymore. That a neighborhood with country club standards thought they could erase 3 generations of history with a checkbook. And if you think that was the worst part, no, that was just Tuesday. You'd think living on 40 acres would buy you some peace. That out here, beyond the suburbs and gated drives, no one could mess with you. But when you're the last holdout between greedy developers and their master plan, you become the problem. After Wilson's visit, the tone changed. Not overnight. It was slower. Like a slow leak you don't notice until your boots are soaked. First came the letters, official-looking envelopes from the county, citing concerns about runoff, building permits, livestock management. Funny thing? I'd passed every inspection 5 years straight. Suddenly, Everything was an issue. I chalked it up to bureaucracy at first. Until the visits started. On a Wednesday morning, I was feeding the chickens when a white SUV pulled up, county logo on the door. Clipboard in hand. We received an anonymous complaint. The man said, someone reported improper waste management. Something about animal feces near the property line. I looked him dead in the eye. It's a farm. That's kind of the deal. He gave a half smile but took pictures anyway. A week later, animal control showed up. We got a report that your cattle don't have adequate shelter. I walked them to the barn. My cows were lounging under a new metal roof with automatic waterers. Cleaner than some condos I've seen. Everything looks fine. One officer admitted. Clearly uncomfortable. But we're required to document the visit. Required by who? That was the moment I stopped reacting and started recording. Let me tell you something about power. It doesn't always look like a courtroom or a flashing badge. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Stacked high. Sent daily. Engineered to overwhelm. Not protect. That's what they were doing, building a case to bury me. One citation at a time. Then it got personal. One evening, just before sunset, I found the north fence line cut in 3 places. Clean cuts. Like wire snipped with bolt cutters. My cattle had wandered down onto a manicured lawn in the new development. I spent an hour rounding them up. While I worked, someone stood across the property line, filming me with their phone. Later that week, some kids from Cypress Ridge came around. Teenagers, probably not even aware they were being used. They threw rocks at my chicken coop, sprayed graffiti on my tractor with the words "sell or rot." I didn't chase them. I just noted the time, set up cameras, and called my lawyer. They're trying to build a paper trail, said Mara Klein, a local attorney I trusted. If they can paint you as non-compliant, disruptive, or a danger to the community, they can apply legal pressure through zoning boards, code enforcement, maybe even condemnation. And the county's in on it? I asked. Not officially. But follow the money. Developers are greasing the wheels. And HOA leadership is driving the buzz. That night, I didn't sleep much. I reviewed old land surveys, grandfathered zoning exemptions, tax records. I scanned every document Grandpa ever filed and loaded it all into a secure hard drive. If they wanted a war of paperwork, they'd get one. 2 weeks later, my neighbor Ellie called. Jake, she whispered. They're having an emergency HOA meeting tonight. Karen, the real boss, the one behind Wilson, she's calling your place a public health crisis. What does that even mean? They're voting to petition the county to declare your farm a health hazard. If that passes, it gives them leverage to force inspections. Maybe even push for emergency condemnation. This wasn't just bullying anymore. This was strategy. And the gloves were off. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my land. It was about control. Erasure. They wanted to scrub this place clean. Like it never existed. Replace stories and soil with concrete and curb appeal. But I wasn't just some stubborn hick they could intimidate. I was the 3rd generation of Lawsons on that farm. And I knew every inch of it better than they knew their own floor plans. So I did what any soldier's son would do. I fortified cameras, legal records, neighbors who still had a backbone. I wasn't just defending a farm. I was defending a legacy. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. You think the sheriff's there to protect your rights, until he shows up on your front porch with a citation in one hand and a real estate brochure in the other. That's when you realize, it's not justice they're after, it's your land. I always knew small towns had their politics. But Maple Hollow was the kind of place where the sheriff waved at you from his cruiser and knew your dog's name. Or at least, that's how it used to be. Things changed when the money showed up. When Karen Whitmore and her developers started shaping the county in their image, clean, controlled, HOA approved, and folks like me became incompatible. Sheriff Dan Carter wasn't just the law. He was Karen's brother-in-law. And once I learned that, Everything made sense. He came down my driveway on a bright Thursday morning. I was splitting wood, sweat dripping down my back, when I saw the gleam of chrome and the spinning blue lights. No sirens, just presence. "Morning, Jake," Carter said, sliding out of his cruiser like he had all day. "Mind if I take a look around?" I wiped my hands on my jeans. "What's the problem, Sheriff?" "Just a few complaints. Noise, waste runoff, unpermitted buildings. Nothing we can't handle amicably. Unless you want to be difficult." That word again. Difficult. That's what they called you when you didn't roll over and sell. "This land's been here longer than you've been in office," I told him. "Nothing's changed but the neighbors." Carter adjusted his sunglasses. "And the neighbors vote. They pay taxes. They make this county look good. Progress has a price. Jake. You either adapt, or you get left behind." "Sounds like a threat," I said, locking eyes with him. "Call it a heads up." He handed me a thick envelope, a formal warning notice citing alleged violations. Inside, I found line after line of bureaucratic jargon: improper fencing, outdated wiring, waste disposal hazards. The kicker? A preliminary penalty estimate topping $200,000. I'd seen this playbook before. Inflate fines until they exceed property value, then seize the land. This wasn't law enforcement. It was economic warfare in uniform. And Sheriff Carter? He wasn't some pawn. He had skin in the game. Literally. Turns out, Carter had purchased 3 lots inside Cypress Ridge, all coincidentally well below market price. That's when the timeline clicked. His shift in tone. His sudden interest in my land. His obsessive pursuit of minor infractions. He wasn't a public servant anymore. He was an enforcer for the HOA's vision, and I was the last piece they hadn't claimed. A week later, after I caught HOA goons tampering with my irrigation ditch, Carter came back. This time with 2 deputies. Lights on. Sirens blaring. It wasn't a visit. It was a performance. I was under the tractor, tightening a bolt when they pulled up. "Jake Lawson," Carter called out. "Step away from the vehicle." "What's this about?" "You are under investigation for multiple county violations. Environmental damage, water diversion, improper livestock management. You are to be detained pending review." I stood up slowly, grease on my hands, heart pounding. Behind the patrol cars, I spotted a black SUV, Karen's crew. Filming. Watching. I laughed. "So this is how it ends? On my knees in front of the people trying to steal my land?" "It's not personal," Carter said. "The hell it's not." The cuffs were cold. He clicked them tight. Tight enough to bruise. The crowd, some neighbors, some HOA loyalists, had gathered by the fence. Some stared in silence. Others smirked. And in that moment, I realized what this was about. Control, fear, spectacle. They didn't need a court. They had the sheriff. But here's what Carter didn't know. He thought I was just another stubborn farmer. A speed bump on his sister-in-law's way to HOA paradise. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had one card left. I'd resisted playing it. Out of pride. Out of the desire to stand on my own. But there's a line. And they crossed it. That night, in the county jail, I made one call. Not to a lawyer, not to a friend, to my father. And that changed everything. They had the sheriff. They had the county board. They had the paper trail. The inspectors. The fake complaints. But they didn't have my father. And when I finally made that call, it wasn't just about saving my farm anymore. It was about exposing a corrupt system that had gone too far. The cell in the county jail was colder than I expected. It wasn't the kind of place meant to hold real criminals. It was the kind designed for intimidation, for show. I sat on a narrow bench, staring at the cracked paint on the wall, trying to figure out what my grandfather would have done. My hands were bruised from the cuffs. My back ached from the floor I'd slept on. And my pride? It was hanging by a thread. For years, I swore I'd never use my father's name to open doors. He was General Richard Lawson, a man who'd led troops across the world, now stationed at the Pentagon, overseeing joint military operations. Growing up, I barely saw him. He missed birthdays, holidays, even my high school graduation. But I never questioned why. He was serving the country, and I stayed behind, serving the land. We'd always respected each other's choices, but I never asked him for help. Until now. The deputy walked in, slapping a clipboard on the desk. One call. Make it count. He handed me an old, wired handset. I took out the laminated card I kept in my wallet, the one my father gave me when I turned 18. It had a number printed in bold. No area code. Just digits. I dialed Office of General Lawson. A crisp voice answered. This is Jake. Jake Lawson. Tell him it's code Blue Oak. 1983. Silence. Then, stand by. 20 seconds passed. The line clicked. Jake? Came the deep, controlled voice I hadn't heard in over a year. Yes, sir. Is this about the land? They arrested me, Dad. Sheriff Carter, he's in bed with the HOA. They're trying to steal the farm. There was a pause. Understood, he said. I'll handle it. Click. That was it. But it was enough. People think power is loud, explosive. But real power? It's quiet, precise. You don't feel it until it moves. And when it moves, it's unstoppable. My father didn't make threats. He made calls. He didn't argue with corrupt sheriffs. He contacted JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, military lawyers with jurisdiction over federal issues, especially those affecting service members and their families. And I wasn't just a farmer anymore. I was the son of a decorated general, a dependent of active duty command, a target of coordinated, illegal coercion, and that made it a federal matter. 2 hours later, the jail buzzed with tension. A black SUV with government plates pulled up. 2 men in civilian clothes stepped out, clean-cut, stone-faced, carrying briefcases and authority. They walked in, flashed credentials, and approached the desk. Colonel James Reeves, Major Anthony Davis, JAG Corps. We're here for Mr. Jake Lawson. The deputy stammered. The booking officer paled. I was brought out, unshackled, and handed over. There appears to be a jurisdictional dispute, Colonel Reeves said. Mr. Lawson is being released into our custody pending further review. As we left the station, Sheriff Carter stood in the hallway, flustered, red-faced, still trying to hold on to control. This is county business, he barked. Not anymore, Reeves replied calmly. General Lawson has initiated a federal inquiry into abuse of power against a military family. I couldn't help it. I smiled. As we drove back toward the farm, I sat in the back seat, still stunned. Major Davis glanced at me through the rear-view mirror. You've stirred up quite a mess, Mr. Lawson. Didn't mean to, I said. Just wanted to keep my farm. Well, Reeves added, your situation has become a potential cornerstone case. You're not the only one. We're finding similar HOA developer enforcement patterns in 3 other states. This isn't just about you anymore. My fists clenched. Good. Let's burn the whole rotten system down. It's funny. I thought calling my father would be admitting weakness. But it turned out to be the strongest move I could make, not because he pulled strings, but because he believed in doing what's right. Just like I did. We just had different weapons. He had the Pentagon, I had the soil. And now we were fighting together. When the courthouse doors opened and General Richard Lawson stepped through, chest full of medals, 4 stars on each shoulder, the room went silent. Not because he was a general, not even because of the documents he carried, but because, for the first time, the people who'd used power to control others realized they were about to be held accountable. The courthouse was standing room only. Farmers in overalls, reporters clutching notepads, HOA members in crisp suits, all of them packed into rows like a powder keg waiting for a match. I stood near the back, flanked by Colonel Reeves and Major Davis. I wasn't wearing a uniform, but I didn't need one. That morning, I'd walked into court not just as Jake Lawson, the stubborn farmer who wouldn't sell. I walked in as the last man standing between greed and justice. And I didn't stand alone anymore. The county commissioner took the podium, clearly uncomfortable. Today's session was called to address escalating concerns over agricultural zoning, property rights, and public health standards related to Mr. Lawson's land. His voice faded into bureaucratic noise. Then Sheriff Carter stood, suit neatly pressed, trying to regain some control. He spun his story, that he was merely enforcing codes, following procedure, responding to citizen concerns. Not a word about Karen. Not a word about the HOA's offers. Not a word about the lots he'd purchased at developer discounts. Then came Karen Whitmore herself, HOA queen bee in her designer blazer and pearl earrings. She clicked to the stand, voice syrupy sweet, painting me as combative, non-cooperative, and disruptive to community harmony. She held up staged photos of my barn, zoomed in on rust, mess, mud. She didn't mention the fields of corn I tended or the 3 dozen eggs my hens laid every day. We simply believe Mr. Lawson's property is incompatible with the vision of Cypress Ridge, she concluded with a smile that could curdle milk. Then the doors opened and General Richard Lawson walked in. Not rushed, not theatrical, just purposeful, like he had when leading troops through enemy lines. He walked to the podium, nodded to the commissioners, and spoke into the mic. My name is General Richard Lawson. I am here to submit evidence of coordinated misconduct, abuse of power, and possible criminal conspiracy involving this county's law enforcement and the HOA of Cypress Ridge. The room held its breath. Major Davis handed out folders. Inside, emails, phone logs, HOA meeting transcripts. A timeline so detailed it left no doubt, this wasn't about public safety, it was about a land grab. I've commanded forces across 3 continents. My father said. I've dealt with insurgents, warlords, and corrupt governments. But I never expected I'd have to defend my own family's farm from officials in my home country. This isn't about zoning. This is about erasing heritage for profit. He turned and pointed to Sheriff Carter. You orchestrated a campaign of harassment, arrests without merit, inspections without warrants, fines engineered to bankrupt a citizen. Then to Karen, and you used the guise of aesthetic standards to manipulate local governance, silence dissent, and line your pockets with developer dollars. They had no response. Not one word. Because the truth? It was undeniable. That courtroom didn't just witness testimony, it witnessed a reckoning. Within 30 minutes, the county commissioners voted to immediately suspend all enforcement actions against me. By the end of the week, Sheriff Carter resigned, facing an ethics inquiry from the state. Karen Whitmore was removed from her HOA post and placed under federal investigation. The Cypress Ridge development was frozen, pending review of illegal zoning approvals, and my farm? Protected, not just by law, but now by national attention. But it didn't stop there. My case, once just a local struggle, became the spark that lit a wildfire. Within 3 months, congressional hearings were opened. HOA tactics in 5 other states were investigated. Legislation was drafted to protect long-standing agricultural properties from targeted harassment. They even named part of it the Lawson Amendment, not for me, but for what it stood for. And as for Maple Hollow, neighbors who once avoided my gaze now nodded in respect. Strangers dropped off seed, offered help at harvest. The division Karen tried to create, it couldn't survive the truth. That land, my land, almost slipped through my fingers. Not because I couldn't work it, not because it had no value, but because I refused to be bought. And in a world where so many give in, sometimes the most radical act is just standing your ground. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to HOA Karen Stories. We tell real, riveting tales of ordinary people standing up to extraordinary abuse of power, and winning. What would you have done in Jake's boots? Drop your thoughts below, and remember, not all heroes wear uniforms. But some of them have 4-star generals on speed dial.